Boris Johnson, the UK's former Prime Minister, has expressed interest in being named the next NATO Secretary General. Johnson had a tough go as Prime Minister for the time that he was in office. Now, as a member of the Conservative Party, Johnson was frequently referred to as the Trump of the UK, but honestly, it was a loose comparison at best. Yes, he had unnecessarily out-of-control hair, and yes, he was very fumbly and very bumbly, and yes, he sometimes said racist or misogynistic or generally inappropriate things on camera, but Johnson differed from Trump in that he actually had experience as a political leader prior to ascending to the highest position in his nation.
Boris, you're going the wrong way. This way. Boris, this way.
He had served as a member of parliament. He was the mayor of London, during which time he oversaw the 2012 Summer Olympics, and he served as his predecessor's foreign secretary. He was arguably more competent in his position than Trump was, despite appearances and despite the outcomes that he produced. Perhaps most notable of those produced outcomes was Brexit, the UK's controversial exit from the European Union. Johnson was a strong and outspoken proponent of Brexit prior to his time as Prime Minister. The success of the Brexit campaign, which itself was controversial, triggered a period of unstable leadership in the UK. Then Prime Minister David Cameron resigned from office when the nation voted for Brexit. The job then fell to Theresa May, who took over the role from Cameron to work out the details of the deal. During her time in office, 2 votes of no confidence were held against her. She survived those, but Parliament also rejected her drafts of the Brexit withdrawal agreement 3 times. May finally resigned from her position in 2019, paving the way for Johnson to take over just months before the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. Now, Johnson got a deal done in early 2020, but it wasn't perfect, specifically his handling of Northern Ireland, an issue that's literally in the news today as I'm recording this. Johnson would later resign following several scandals, including his hiring of someone who he knew had been previously accused of sexual misconduct, and for his knowledge of parties at Downing Street during the COVID lockdowns. Now, if those parties maybe don't sound worthy of the outrage it garnered, keep in mind that the lockdowns, which were put in place by Johnson's government, were pretty severe. There's even a picture of the Queen sitting by herself at her husband's funeral. Johnson was succeeded by Liz Truss, who lasted less than 2 months, and today Rishi Sunak is the UK Prime Minister. Now, in his final address to Parliament, Johnson gave some words of advice: to stay close to the Americans, to stick up for the Ukrainians, to stick up for freedom and democracy everywhere, and to cut taxes and deregulate wherever you can. So that's Boris Johnson in a very, very small nutshell, but now he's got his sights set on his next possible move. He's looking to NATO. Now, NATO is a hot topic these days because of the war in Ukraine. Since Russia invaded its neighbor over a year ago, Ukraine has expressed interest in joining NATO. Ukraine is currently a NATO partner, but not a member, which means that while it cooperates with NATO, NATO isn't obligated to back Ukraine in a situation like the one we're currently seeing in Russia. That's why many NATO member nations are donating weapons, supplies, and money to Ukraine to support it in the conflict, but they're not actually engaging in the conflict themselves. From the start of the Russian invasion, the concern has always been that Russia will seek to expand further beyond Ukraine, which would inevitably involve Russia attacking a member of NATO, which would then kick off a third world war, one with nuclear capabilities. Other NATO partners, Sweden and Finland, have also been in talks to join NATO officially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the belief being that Russia would be much less likely to invade a NATO member since Russia would be unable to win that war. It is ironic now that Boris Johnson, a man who was forced to resign from his role as Prime Minister, and a man who fully supported efforts to remove the UK from the EU, would now want to be the Secretary General for a different large alliance. In response to the former Italian Prime Minister suggesting that a representative from EU should be the next NATO Secretary General, Johnson said, quote, "I completely disagree with him. I think there are other candidates outside the European Union. It doesn't have to be the EU. I currently consider myself a candidate. It's a good and important position." Now, I know you all know this, but it is worth reminding people that the EU and NATO are not the same thing, despite there being a lot of overlap between the two, at least as far as member nations. Still, Johnson's reputation has been tarnished by his tenure as prime minister, and it seems as though he'd have a hard time selling himself as a credible candidate for such a role. All right, that's it for me. If you got anything out of this, please like and subscribe, and be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Thanks so much.